2 weeks on, military leaders remain in control of Niger following the ouster of the country's president. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. There's been no movement towards resolving the government crisis in Niger. The military intervention threatened by the 15-member Economic Community of West African States, known as Ecowas, has given way to diplomacy, at least for now. The bloc imposed sanctions and demanded the reinstatement of ousted President Mohamed Bazoum by last Sunday. A change of regime in Niger is seen by some as a blow to the West, more specifically to France and the United States. Niger has become the latest country in West Africa where the army has seized control, following Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali and Chad, all former French colonies. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Kingsley Moghalu served as Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. He's currently President of the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation. Joao Toke is an Associate Professor at the American Graduate School of International Affairs and Diplomacy in Paris. Also with us, Anton Vedyashin. He's a Russia and European History Professor at American University. And Abdullahi Boru Halake is an Africa Security and Policy Analyst. Welcome to all of you. Abdullahi, let me start with you. What was the reason behind this coup? Was it a power grab by the military? Or was it a genuine effort to redress some of the very deep-seated grievances that we've been hearing about that the people of Niger have been experiencing?
Thank you so much, Anna. I think it is a combination of both, but I will place it this way. The trigger was really the deposed President Mohamed Bazoum's attempt to try and reform the country, but specifically the military, which was, enjoying a disproportionate amount of interest. Remember, Bazoum, just days before his inauguration as a president after the election, there was an attempted coup. And the guy who foiled that coup is the same guy who engineered this coup against Bazoum. So that is the trigger. But in terms of the underlying structural problems that has been festering, this is a combination of two forces. One, the French policy in the region, because most of those countries, like you've said, are former French colonies. But also, we are entering the end of the war on terror in that region. And also in many parts of the continent. The reality is, once you securitize a region and you make the solution to a problem security, inevitably, these are some of the vagaries that display itself with coup leaders. I'm not sitting here to say, that coup is something that needs to be celebrated, because there are very few positive things about military coups. But also, I think we have to be very, very careful in trying to force the country from the trajectory that it might have taken.
And Abdullahi, very briefly, if you could, when you talk about the reforms that the president was trying to impose on the military, what are we talking about?
Essentially, because Niger, like many countries in that region, do not have a very strong state presence in various areas, including in the north of the country, what happens is a lot of foreign aid, largely military training and support, comes in. And so suddenly what you realize is very many military groups and formation, and especially in former French colonies, what we call the presidential guards, they become very, very powerful. And so and then that also not only gives them power, but also it becomes a source of corruption. And this is something that was festering under the previous administration of Mr. Issahafu, who Mr. Bazoum is also a protege, because they come from the same political party. It felt like it was almost like him handing over power to him. But that group was getting very powerful, including Mr. Chiani, who was, spearheading this particular coup. So I think he was trying to rein in on that and also trying to chip at the old network of the previous president.
Okay, let's go to Paris to Joëv Turquet. Joëv, Niger, of course, is, as we've been saying, a former French colony, and France has very close economic ties with Niger and is among a group of Western countries with a military presence in the country. And when you talk about the nature of the relationship between France and Niger, I mean, it depends on who you talk to. You'll get different answers. I mean, I've been looking at some. The French journalist Nabila Ramdani recently wrote in The Guardian that France retains a quasi-empire in Africa by stealth. Florence Boyer at France's Research Institute for Development says the strongest argument that we're hearing now is against the French military presence in Niger. And Political Science Quarterly says Paris has developed what it calls a type of nested neo-colonial association with the states of limited sovereignty. So how would you characterize it? I mean, is it in some ways a neo-colonial relationship?
Well, it does have a neo-colonial flavor one way or the other. Let it be on the terrain or let it be in the discourse. And we know that the discourse and the narrative count so much, especially for the young generation in Africa, keeping in mind that those who reject in a very violent and hostile type way French presence in Niger and in Mali and elsewhere in West Africa actually have never seen any moment of French regime or French direct power implied in the country, as we're speaking about decolonization, which had taken place about 60 years ago. So it's very much the way the story travels and the narrative travels, and this is especially important for the young generation, which consumes a lot of social networks, which is perhaps more fragile in terms of external influence. I have in mind, of course, some of supposedly Russian and Wagner type interventions, which were very aggressively addressed against France. However, the basic truth is that French policy in Africa, or the France-Afrique, as the French call it for 3 generations now, is a highly problematic set of policies. And which is, in France itself, there are calls to reform this France-Afrique for decades now. Every new president entering the Élysée Palace, among other things, that the new president said, starting from De Gaulle and Pompidou and Chirac and Giscard d'Estaing and Mitterrand and Macron, who is the actual president, one of the things they always say is, okay, this time we're going to open a new chapter in the relations between France and Africa, mainly West Africa. They say there are some interesting documents which are elaborated, they come and go, and then we see now with the perspective of time that nothing substantially moves. And the overall appreciation, the overall posture in Africa itself, I believe, is the ex-colonial power is still behaving there in a relatively arrogant way, trying to influence foreign policy, not to speak about the economic interests, of course, which France has and admits in Niger, specifically regarding uranium, which I know it's important. So you see, you've got the you've got a whole variety of appreciations of which last sets of truth are present.
Okay. Kingsley, great to have you with us in the studio. We've been talking about the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS as it's known. Initially, ECOWAS threatened to use military action to restore the president back to office. And after that, then they said, look, no, we'll be looking at a diplomatic solution. But not all member states are on board. We've got Guinea, Mali, and Burkina Faso with countries which actually support the coup. So given this kind of division, how effective can ECOWAS be?
ECOWAS has been broadly an effective regional organization, founded in 1975 at the instance of Nigeria, which really produces almost 2/3 of the GDP of the 15-member regional body. So Nigeria is a very big dynamo in ECOWAS. ECOWAS faces the gravest threat to its cohesion today with the Niger crisis, because with the division that you have pointed to, there could be a split in the body. Some countries may leave if things get very messy and get very violent. So that's a big threat. Now, the ECOWAS threat of violence or the use of force, I think, was premature. And that's one of the reasons you've seen the group have to pull back. And so, of course, there has been some loss of credibility. One of the reasons that this happened is because any ECOWAS military intervention in Niger will be driven mainly by the Nigerian armed forces. Nigeria is the very big neighbor to the south of Niger, and Niger is a very, very intertwined neighbor to the north of Nigeria. And many, many Nigerians expressed strong reservations, especially at a time like this, when Nigeria is going through a lot of economic crisis. Nigeria is also faced with security problems, and there are also some political challenges, including to Nigeria's democracy itself. The presidential election, we have President Tinubu, but those that lost the presidential election or who were declared the losers are still contesting in court against the sitting president. So, you know, ECOWAS really does face a very, very difficult time. And so many people felt they should push more aggressively diplomacy first, maybe sanctions, and then we will see. But I would say that the most important lesson of the coup in Niger for African leaders is three things. One, you've got to fight terrorism and insecurity effectively. Two, you've got to practice democracy in such a way that is inclusive and brings in a lot of, you know, the components, different opinions in your country. And three, you've got to be an effective state. You've got to govern effectively. In many of these African countries in the Sahel, you see this lacking. And this is what gives rise to this increasing trend of military coups, which is very dangerous, because from the coups in Burkina Faso and in Mali, we have not seen the coups solve the problems they claimed they were out to solve.
Right, Kingsley, isn't there another risk for ECOWAS here? I mean, we've seen these demonstrations which have taken place in Niamey.
Yes.
You know, a large part of the country lives in poverty.
Yes.
A little under 50%. Literacy is only at about 37%. That if ECOWAS plays any role in restoring the president back to office, it will be seen as acting against the interests of ordinary people, the ordinary people of Niger.
Well, that's a risk, but it depends on how the narrative is created, and that's why diplomacy is very, very important.
Right.
The complication we see is that the coup in Niger does seem to be popular with a significant portion, but the fact of the matter is that it breaks the ECOWAS protocols against military interventions. ECOWAS wants to be a region of democratic states, and so it's natural and expected that the ECOWAS will want to intervene in some way to restore democracy. Whether that happens diplomatically, whether it happens militarily is a different matter. But I think it's better if it should happen diplomatically. But that means that some compromises may have to be made with the regime that is in Niger today. Because, as you said, Niger is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's a very large country, larger than Nigeria in landmass. And it's very painful and tragic to see what's happening in the Sahel and in Niger in particular, where African countries are seen as just, you know, things on a chessboard, you know, for foreign global powers. That's really sad. And I think it's time Africans made a real decision about taking charge of their future.
Okay. Anton Fadiashian, Western countries have thousands of troops in Niger. The French have about 1,500 troops. The Americans have troops there. They even have a drone base there where drones take off to bomb other African countries. But the Russians also have a force there. The Wagner force is also in Niger. And if we look at recent developments, the United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he visited Niger. He's the first Secretary of State to do that. Victoria Newland, another senior Biden official, visited just this week. Why is Niger important? I mean, what is its geostrategic importance?
The answer to that question, Anand, has a lot to do with the broader importance of this region. And we see here the intersection of two issues, the struggle against extremism and, of course, geoeconomics, the economic angle. First of all, Niger is situated in a way that it touches on two very important West African countries, Algeria in the north, and that's the Mediterranean world, and of course Nigeria in the south. And as Kingsley correctly mentioned, it is enormous in terms of territory. It is a very convenient base from which to project power to all of its neighbors, which is why AB 201 or 201, the Air Force base that you had just referred to, that the United States recently built and is running and dedicates an enormous amount of resources to, has been situated in Niger. The problem with this is that Niger, as many countries in the global south, has fallen a victim to the security paradigm, which is a very complex trap. It involves outside states, mostly Western, because they have the resources to conduct a global anti-war campaign, coming in, establishing bases, working closely with the militaries of the countries, including the Nigerian one, by the way, whose ties have not been with China or Russia, but has been with the French and the Americans. They pump a lot of resources into the militaries, increasing their influence within their respective states. And that reflects not terribly well on the governments that host them, because the rest of the population is unfortunately mired in poverty. And that's the other intersecting issue here that creates the instability, which is the general poverty of this part of the world, which is a great tragedy and in large part, of course, a legacy of European colonialism, which is what that Africa in general as a continent, and the Sahel in particular, is remarkably rich in resources, but the profits from them are horribly, disproportionately spread over the population. There's a comprador class, which has been essentially co-opted by major international corporations, and there's no trickle down effect. And in the context of the Green Revolution, which regardless of how our viewers may feel about it, is a fact, it's unfolding and it's not going to go anywhere, the metals and the resources with which this part of Africa, not just Niger, but the countries next to it, Niger in particular, is very rich. These metals, the uranium ore, will become more important, more valuable, more competitive. And so the Green Revolution is beginning to spark a race for resources, which unfortunately, as it always has done, will spill over into conflicts, coups d'etats, political instability. So it is up to the African leadership to see if they can navigate this new world in a way that benefits their nations and their people.
Abdullahi, I want to get your view on what Anton was talking about, the fact that you have a country like Niger, which is very rich in natural resources, uranium, iron ore, oil, diamonds. But as Anton pointed out, there is a disproportionate way in which the profits from these natural resources are divided. I mean, the question is, why is a country so richly endowed like Niger is, would still have such a high poverty rate?
I think it's an indictment on the elite in the country to begin with, because what the war on terror has done is that it has disincentivized this elite to invest in anything. So what they do is they work with not the State Department, but with the DoD. The DoD says we want to establish a military base here, we offer training, we'll do this. And as a result, what happens is that within the United States, the military industrial complex is very well endowed. So if the DoD signs a deal with the country, it's not just the DoD, there are also outside contractors that benefits from that deal. And some of those monies from these defense contractors goes and it's funneled into the political processes of some of the senators because they're the ones who will determine the budget. Simultaneously, the same happens in some of these countries where the military and the political elite are so much sheltered from accountability, because if the United States one day wakes up and say, hey, look, you're not following good governance, human rights, and all that stuff, we are going to, you should behave. The Nigerian authorities will say, look, we can work with any other countries, or you guys should leave. We'll work with China, we'll work with that. So as a result, the war on terror has created a perverse incentives here in the United States and also in some of the other Western countries, as well as in those countries where war on terror is conducted, including Niger. Yeah. Little wonder you have a massive base, American military base, 110 million, and the French also has a base. As a result, this really makes it very hard for the military leaders or political leaders in these countries to be accountable, leaving a huge chunk of the country. Niger is big. Niger is twice the size of France. So as a result, you're seeing the level of poverty. Why would Niger, that is almost in the top 10, I think it's number 7 in terms of uranium production.
That's right, yeah.
70% of its electricity comes from Nigeria. It's a severe repudiation of France-Afrique and war on terror. Yeah. But now it's happening at a time when, yes, we do not have a multipolar world, but we certainly do not live in a unipolar world. Yeah. And that makes it very, very difficult. Okay. But the ultimate loser is an African, it's African people.
Okay. Joab Tucker, we're looking at this in so many ways, but it seems that France is central to what is happening in Niger. President Emmanuel Macron said France will not tolerate any attack against the country or its interests. If anybody was hurt, Macron said retaliation would come, quote, immediately and uncompromisingly. Do you believe the French would actually use military force to secure what it believes are threats to its security, to its interests in the country?
Only in an extremely severe and threatening scenario, which I don't think right now is on the immediate ramp. But of course, keep in mind that the French had 1,500 soldiers, not only in Niger, but in Niamey, and not only in the capital, in the airport of the capital, which is practically the #1 strategic site of the country, and which one way or the other would most probably be the base of any military intervention if such an intervention is there in the pipelines, even if the French were not to take place directly or indirectly of such a military initiative, which is, say, EWACS, is on the table, on the agenda. And it's one of the options, the last option, hopefully, but one of the options. So, no, I think the language of President Macron in that sense is the one which clearly states that France has interests and personnel and citizens to protect. Right. And it actually expresses the deep deception which the French had gone through about 2 weeks ago when this coup d'etat took place. It surprised everybody, including the intelligence services and the military echelon in France. It was really out of sight, completely out of sight, contrary to previous ones.
All right, let me get the view from Kingsley. Kingsley, you wanted to say something about the likelihood of French military intervention.
Yes, it's not just about French military intervention per se. I think there's likelihood of further violence and military intervention if the junta refuses to step down. We've just heard two things. We've just heard the formation of some resistance, supposedly internally. This is a very important development, and it's possible that external powers may latch onto that to try to force out the regime that is there now. Secondly, Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland made clear to the junta that the U.S. is opposed to the coup, and also referred to the possibility of the use of force. Now, in ECOWAS, although the Nigerian parliament has, for now, stopped the government from mobilizing its own troops as part of an ECOWAS force, but there may be the possibility of some other countries in ECOWAS putting together troops that may still intervene. So the tragedy of this is that Niger seems likely to explode in what you might call the African World War anytime soon, except the regime gives way. The interests from ECOWAS, from France, from the United States, from Russia are too strong for this not to happen, except the regime steps down. So that's my prognosis. It's a very unfortunate one, but the best path to peace is that the junta negotiates some compromise and agrees to step down and for some return to constitutional order. Otherwise, I don't see how there will not be a conflict in Niger, one way or the other.
Anton, if we look at this a little bit more broadly, I mean, it looks like this is the new battle for resources on the African continent. It's a little bit reminiscent of the Cold War, isn't it? Are we seeing a new Cold War here?
Well, we're seeing a competition for resources. The Cold War was defined for me, at least first and foremost, by ideological struggle. We don't see much of that at all right now, although there are progressivist, leftist, to call them nativist African leaders who certainly sound like the leaders of the decolonization period of the mid-20th century. Ibrahim Traoré, for example, his speech at the Russia-Africa Forum in St. Petersburg, I listened to it carefully. I was stunned by what a throwback it was to the heady days of decolonization fueled by leftist rhetoric. But these are really exceptions. What we're looking at more right now, I think what it resembles more is the scramble for Africa of the 1880s and the 1890s between the European great powers, because ultimately it's the resources that matter. Regardless, though, whether the scramble would have been driven by ideology or economics, it is up to the Africans to do their best to take their fate into their hands and to prevent outside powers from making pawns of them, as has so often happened in modern history.
Kingsley, I've only got about 15 seconds.
Sure.
What is the outlook? Do you see a solution in the short term, or could this be something that festers for a very long time?
I think it could fester for quite a while. But like I said, I see the signs of this regime surviving as very slim. Based on the confluence of factors and interests. Great powers, ECOWAS countries, the outlook is not pretty at all.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.